Hey everyone, and welcome to the latest Digital Foundry Direct Weekly. It's our weekly chat show where we talk about the latest gaming and technology news. Joining me this week, John Linneman.
Rich, how's it going, buddy? Good to have you here after you took a week away to enjoy some other good stuff. So
absolutely. I just couldn't stay away. And also Alex Battaglia.
Yeah, surprise guest this week. I wasn't there last week because I also was away doing things, work things, and now I'm back and we're good to go.
The trio's back, guys. I mean, this is,
Yes, the triumvirate.
Exactly.
Back together. Okay, well, let's begin. We're going to address a really interesting topic that cropped up overnight, which is basically almost like a tweet war between Nintendo of Japan and Bloomberg. Bloomberg basically saying that there is a 4K Switch in development and that development kits are out, verified with 11 sources. And remarkably, Nintendo of Japan just put out a couple of tweets, I think, basically saying that it's inaccurate and that there isn't a 4K Switch. John, what do you make of all of this?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of people see a denial like that from Nintendo and think, oh, it's not true. But, you have to look very carefully at the language they use and the way they refer to the Switch. They don't use a product name. And the fact is like, They need to appease shareholders and their business partners first and foremost. They're launching new hardware. They're going to have to be cautious about this, right? So I don't think that means anything as far as a denial is concerned. And if it was really, truly false, I do think a site like Bloomberg would remove their article, but they have not, right? It's still there. And we've talked about rumors and stuff earlier this year, and you were always adamant that the Switch releasing this year would not be an enhanced model outside of maybe a different screen or screen controller. You were exactly right. But there are plenty of other rumors out there, and I think it's pretty clear that there is going to be something in the works. It's just a matter of when we'll see it and in what form, right?
Absolutely, I agree. And although I did say that there wouldn't be a next generation Switch this year, I think it is pretty clear at this point that there is going to be a next generation Switch. Of course, there's going to be. I also, with Bloomberg in saying that development kits are out there, I think that is self-evident at this point. But I just think maybe the initial reporting was muddied by the concept that the two devices were passed off as one, if you like. It was basically described as a new Switch model with an OLED screen that would also have a 4K output, which it doesn't. But this new model does, and I believe that the dev kits do exist. So it's basically just a bit of confusion there, I think. But I do think what is absolutely remarkable is the concept of a massive company like Nintendo essentially calling out a specific outlet. And I think the reason is that Bloomberg is so widely read by investors. So they kind of feel they have to put the record straight. Although I don't think they have put the record straight because, fundamentally, while the initial reporting may have been confused, we kind of know that there is going to be a next generation console. And we kind of know that the development kits are out there. And it kind of takes away credibility from Nintendo almost to put those tweets out. And typically, it is a case of no comment, right?
Yeah, but Rich, they've done this before. Like, I think it was with the DS Lite and maybe another platform where they essentially denied it completely just in this way. And then like 2 weeks later or something, it was revealed. So, you really can't read anything into these denials, right? Like, it's business, right?
Yeah. What's your take on this, Alex?
I'm actually curious about the release date because with the current semiconductor shortages and the Bloomberg article points this out really well too, talking with like PCB and other suppliers for Nintendo products off the record, describing that essentially all the semiconductor industry is already booked and overstrained for supply for years to come, almost essentially. So it is the big question mark is essentially when will this actually be coming out? Because it almost feels unrealistic that it would be next year at this point due to this semiconductor shortage. And unless they somehow managed in this time to secure, a contract to produce millions of units for the first year, otherwise it's going to be a paper launch, So I'm curious about when it'll actually launch. I definitely think it exists. I definitely think those development kits out there. I found the tweet from Nintendo, I don't know, a bit strange because it's pretty obvious that this thing exists at this point.
I mean, there has been the possibility raised that there was a 4K Switch coming out and that it's been cancelled. And I guess there is maybe an outside chance that that specific model might have been sort of canned. I mean, if we go back into the past, there was actually an original Nintendo Tegra version of the 3DS. Development kits were made. It never happened. They went with a different solution for the silicon there. But, you know, that was an example of a development kit that did actually get out there. But in this case, the sheer costs involved in creating multiple in-development consoles, along with the fact that fundamentally, I really do think they need to continue the Switch lineage. It needs to be an Nvidia-based console, in my opinion. I just don't really see the latitude for that particular scenario happening. In terms of what you were saying about the semiconductor stuff there, Alex, I'm inclined to agree, but I would also suspect that Nintendo would have got stuff booked years in advance. They're probably part of that ordering process. And obviously, we are seeing gradually that more PS5s and Series X's are getting out there. So I do think the shortage may well be coming to an end at some point. So I do think there is probably latitude for them getting a console out there. But I don't know. It's just this kind of unseemly bun fight between Bloomberg and Nintendo that I'm finding quite fascinating at this point. Okay, so moving on to the next topic then. Quite a lot happening with Xbox Series consoles in terms of new features. Pretty welcome stuff, I think. And a couple of topics we want to talk about. The new 4K dash for the Series X. But first of all, Dolby Vision is now supported on Xbox Series consoles. And apparently 100 games are supported. Now, you've looked at this, right, John?
Yes, that's right. I have taken a look at this. I was part of the preview program as well, so it has been available for a while. But I did spend more time with it yesterday, specifically testing games like Gears 5, which is on the list as far as supported games are concerned. So first of all, I am using an LG CX OLED, or C10, I guess you could say, which does not yet have the Dolby Vision 120 Hz mode support, though that has been in the engineering firmware since the summer, so I do believe it will arrive. So I can only test it at 60 Hz for now, but the results are really interesting. And I'm curious, I need to look more into how Dolby Vision actually works on the Xbox, because there does seem to be two types. There's like display-led and player-led Dolby Vision, and there is a difference in terms of the end result. And I've often wondered if this is the reason why it does not play Dolby Vision UHD Blu-ray discs, actually. But as far as games are concerned, so the main thing I noticed is that this seems to impact detail in highlights. Essentially, you have bright highlights, and this is what makes HDR presentations sort of pop. And the issue with regular HDR10 is that the metadata is not static, and it has less of a relation connection to the TV or the display itself. And there can be some clipping that occurs, especially in those brighter tones. And obviously, traditionally, you would want to calibrate the game or your console and the TV to sort of rein that in, so to speak. Like, for instance, a game, you can sort of set the maximum luminance for HDR. And if you set it too high, you end up basically clipping, right? So you kind of want to match your display. Dolby Vision matches closer to the display in that sense. So what I've basically noticed then is that Dolby Vision games, so far at least, appear slightly less bright overall than just using HDR10, but you gain more detail in highlight regions. And that's kind of the main thing. Now, again, we kind of have to wait to see where this goes from here and see how different it is. But fundamentally, it's very, very similar. And I think anybody that's really been seeing differences, it probably comes down to how their displays are calibrated, because the Dolby Vision mode is different than the HDR mode. They both have independent settings, and there are differences in how you want to set up your TV based on what you're doing with the HDR output. So, it's certainly not a game changer or anything, but it's a really interesting addition. And I actually think this could help a lot with displays that are perhaps Slightly less capable, maybe. Although I don't know how many lower end or mid-tier displays even support Dolby Vision, so that's a tricky one.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at Microsoft's summary here. It says gaming in Dolby Vision launches today on Xbox Series XS. More than 100 next-gen HDR titles optimized for Series XS are available now or coming soon. But then it says, in addition, thousands of classic HDR and auto HDR games will benefit from improved picture quality through new Dolby Vision enhancement on Xbox Series XS. So on the first point, it seems to be suggesting that content is being authored for Dolby Vision, which is interesting. But on the second point, it sounds as though we have almost like, I don't know, interpolation. How does this work?
The main thing I've noticed is that when you enable Dolby Vision on the Xbox in the settings menu, any game that supports HDR seems to output in Dolby Vision. So it doesn't necessarily require a native implementation to work. And I have tested some games that do not seem to have native Dolby Vision support. And they kind of still look similar to what I just described, where you get a little bit more highlight detail, perhaps. But the overall average picture level is slightly reduced, at least by my eye. Because there's more than just Dolby Vision at stake. There's also the option to essentially, I guess, master the game, you might call it, where for HGIG, which is another standard for HDR that they kind of use. It's not quite the same thing, but it's a tone mapping thing. And games that, when using that correctly, then it actually abides by the system level settings of the Xbox, which are like configured nicely for the screen. And you can get some really nice looking accurate results from that. So that's all to say is that the situation around HDR is still rather complex. You have a lot of options at your disposal, and how it looks is going to depend both upon your TV and how each of the settings have been calibrated, as well as obviously which settings you select. Like for instance, if you're using HDR10 on the LG OLEDs, you can set automatic tone mapping, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it has its uses. Like if you want to use black frame insertion, if you're turning that on, actually boosts the overall brightness even further, which is great for that. Also, it just provides a super bright image if that's what you're looking for, versus one that's perhaps more correct, where you have really bright highlights and darker shadows. So it's just an ability to sort of adjust the picture to your liking, where Dolby Vision is very defined, if you will. So there's less room to manipulate anything there, but probably more accurate. So I'm just happy to see that Xbox is supporting these types of technologies. And I think specifically Xbox is driving stuff like this. It's driving the HDR formats. It's driving VRR. And even stuff like, it's been doing it for a while, but Dolby Atmos support, for instance. Like, I sure wish you could get that on PS5 as well, because, if you have an Atmos setup, it adds a lot to the experience. So it's really nice to see all of this stuff there. So I do recommend at least everybody give it a try if their display supports Dolby Vision, especially if you're using an LG OLED or equivalent with that support. But you might actually find yourself preferring HDR10 specifically.
You can, of course, turn it off and go back to the standard.
You can do both. It's no problem. It allows you to choose. So it's all good.
Absolutely. Okay, good stuff. Well, the other thing that's kind of cropped up, it's also in the preview builds at the moment, should be rolling out to everybody. But the Xbox now has a higher resolution dashboard if you have a Series X. And there was some kind of almost non-committal kind of language as to what kind of resolution you were getting. So we did actually download the preview, take a look at it, got some screenshots and video here. This is a 1080p video, so maybe if we run parts of the video stream zoomed in at 100%, you can see what's going on. But Alex, you took a look at some of the shots here. What do you reckon about this new dashboard? Is it a higher resolution? What is it doing?
Yeah, I think based on what I saw, it looked like the text was resolving into the 4K pixel grid, which is different than it was before, where it would be 1080p text upscaled. So the rest of the image though, like for example, these symbols for like the Microsoft Store, as well as I would say the background images in the little tiles themselves, seem to not look like native 4K to me. And I think this makes sense though, like because having text render, which is text is usually done via vector graphics of some sort, having text render at a higher resolution doesn't take up necessarily a lot more video memory. Increasing the size of all these images that need to be loaded and put into memory, such as these symbols and these icons and whatnot, which are not vector graphics, well, that would take up more memory. So this seems like a good compromise in that way, where text can be higher res and look clearer, but it's not wasting video memory.
You might be completely right about this, and in fact, there's a good chance you are. But I wouldn't draw any conclusions just yet based on the experience we had with PS4 Pro, because when that launched in late 2016, it also had a 4K dashboard right from the start, right? But game developers actually had to update the artwork for the different images, right? So initially, all of the images, just like you see on the Microsoft side, were still 1080p, so they were blurry, low res. But over time, and as new games released, games started to receive updates, I believe, that would basically raise the resolution of the core artwork, and it looked better in time. So there is still room for that to happen here, I think. We just don't know yet because it hasn't been done.
It does sound likely, though, right? That, basically they've got a 4K dashboard now, so it is time to start rolling out 4K material for all elements of the dashboard. But if you think about how old the infrastructure will be for legacy titles, the assets specifically, I suspect you're right. I don't think developers are going to go back and redo all of their artwork to be a higher resolution. But going forward, if they are either supplying higher resolution assets or lower and higher resolution assets, then I think it's going to make a big difference. But yeah, I took a look at the new dashboard, and it is better. It is clearly a higher resolution. There was some confusion as to whether it is actually a 4K dash when the feature was first announced. But, the fundamentals are there, right? It does seem to be a 4K dash. It's just that all of the assets aren't fully conformed to the new standard yet. But fingers crossed over time it will be resolved. But it's definitely a step in the right direction because it always felt a bit odd, starting with Xbox One X, that you had this 4K console, but, you didn't get a 4K experience when you booted the machine and when you interacted with the system. It didn't kind of seem right. And then I remember, John, when we were in at Microsoft last year and Series X still had the 1080p dash, and we were kind of, okay. And the explanation given at the time was that they wanted to give more memory to titles, which I think is perfectly valid. But it looks as though they've done this without reducing the system software overhead on the console, which is just awesome. But I guess, just wait and see. But certainly in the short term, I think there's a big improvement to it. So, good stuff, Microsoft. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. And this is actually really interesting, especially since Digital Foundry's parent company runs events. Basically, the Tokyo Game Show is now happening, and you can visit in virtual reality. And apparently it's really, really good. And John's going to tell us all about this.
Yeah, so this was really interesting. It's super neat to see. The idea here is that, obviously with the pandemic, trade shows haven't been happening so much. They've been attempting to move everything online. And to be honest, it hasn't always worked out that well, right? Like browsing around a website just doesn't have that same impact. So I was really interested to see what they were attempting here at TGS, and actually they have a full application you can download. They also have it available for Oculus Quest platforms, but you basically pop on the headset and you're dropped into this like weird, like circular floating fortress thing over the ocean. And you're given full reign to explore around and check out all the different booths for the companies. So it doesn't mimic the actual like Mesa, right? It's more, they go further with it. So for instance, you go into the Capcom booth and it's all like this giant tree fortress, and you can walk around up the stairs and cross bridges, and there's huge like Monster Hunter creatures like everywhere. But then there's like floating trailers, like just you can reach up and grab like a display down and like play the trailers and all that. And there's like images and things to collect in there and find. And so you're basically going through all these different areas and sort of experiencing the vision of whatever it is each publisher wanted to include, including stuff like there's a VR game in there, which takes place in a high school. So, you kind of can guess what it's about. But they actually they included the full classroom set from the game with one of the characters in there as well. So you can like walk into the set of what's going to be in the game. But just kind of look around, and that's really interesting to see. So it's awesome. They also had like museums pieces, like they had all over the place. They had like posters from all the old TGSs that you could find and like zoom in and look at them closely. They had like Famitsu magazines. They had a whole section for Famitsu, and they had stuff there and like old magazine issues you could look at. And there's even just like a little meta game attached to it, like finding stuff and getting little quests from there as well. And, obviously you're still just ultimately looking at trailers and media and stuff, but it gives you this really cool feeling of being in a very large space. And when you first walk in there and there's a gigantic, like 100-foot chocobo statue, or in Sonic the Hedgehog, you're as big as his shoe. It's interesting. It's weird.
Is this a downloadable client, or is it one in your browser? Oh, it is. Okay, so
it seems like there might be a browser option, but in my case, I actually downloaded the full client, and you run it, and then it installs some data, and then you go from there, and you just hop on in and play.
Does it seem to be Unity, Unreal?
It was made in Unity. So
okay.
And I guess the question is I think TGS is just starting or just about to start, or I don't know exactly by the time we're recording this, but the only thing I'm wondering is whether they'll allow like essentially multiplayer, like other people in there. And there wasn't anybody else in there, but there's lots of weird little like bots and things floating around and like that you can talk to and get info from. And they even have a live theater that you can go into with this huge screen and just like all these weird little floating robots in the audience that you can mingle around and watch trailers and demonstrations of stuff. So, and I walked in there and I'm like, man, if they like showed like press conferences for like the big three or something in a virtual theater like that as like an optional thing, that would be really cool. Right. And it just, it's very clear in there as well. They're saying, there's messages around like, this is our first attempt at this. Leave feedback in this area of the virtual world. Let us know what you think. Like, it's still very early. You can tell they're experimenting with the concept of doing a trade show thing in VR, but man, it's I like the concept a lot. And this is the first time I've seen an attempt at doing some sort of trade show related thing at home that actually felt like interesting enough to look at. I mean, you remember the E3 website.
Yeah.
it's a long way from that.
But this works on multiple platforms, right? So if you've got a Quest, or if you've got like a Rift, you should be good to go, or Valve Index.
That's right, yeah. And actually, I only tried one. They actually have GameFloat and GameFloat Sky. And the idea is that, so it looks like it's two separate arena. I didn't try GameFloat Sky, and I'm not sure what that does. I just tried GameFloat. But yeah, that when you load that up or like click on it on the website, you're actually given the option to, you can do Oculus Quest or Quest 2, which has one link. It has the Oculus Rift, HTC Vive on another, and then it just says PC Mac no Sobikata. So how to play it on there. Yeah, I mean, they seem to have really tried to make this accessible to as many people as possible. And if you look at the requirements even, it's like a Core i5 8250U and an Intel UHD graphics 620.
Okay.
So it's like very
much everything. Yeah.
I mean, it has to run on the Quest, right? So it's pretty low spec, but it's cool. It's effective. And it's just a taste. And somehow this feels like, you're the vision of old Japan or something, where it's like the future is now kind of feeling, so, not necessarily a game changer yet, but the potential for something really awesome is here. And I do recommend anyone that has a VR headset, just go walk around and enjoy, because it's kind of fun to see.
Yeah, we're in a weird situation with shows, right? Because on the one hand, the pandemic has shown just how digital everything already is, right? I mean, E3 basically is a digital event and has been for years, but it did have that physical component where we could go and actually play games and report about them, get hands-on, speak to game makers, executives and whatnot. So that had value. But we haven't been able to do that for a couple of years. I think PAX West happened recently, and it was a very different event to what we've seen previously. And I still don't think that virtual events can kind of do the job of, the networking side of things, and crucially the hands-on things. And obviously, because our company has a lot to do with events, I've been thinking a lot about this. And fundamentally, stuff like EGX and PAX is all about the hands-on experience. And I still think that we haven't been able to properly replicate the hands-on component of these shows. And I still think, cloud streaming is probably the way forward there. Get some client software into the cloud, stream it to users, actually get some hands-on time. I think people accept the limitations of the cloud at this point. Some people don't even notice them, but that is maybe, as well as this kind of VR interface with a virtual event, actually bringing that hands-on component and doing it on a mass scale, I think is probably the next step forward. I'm surprised we haven't seen it. Stadia could do it, although you'd have to port your software to Stadia. GeForce Now, they could do it.
I actually think this is feasible because they have the interface already to display video within this virtual TGS, right? So they just take it one step further and implement sort of a streaming solution, sort of layer into that. So you walk up to one of these panels and you're basically playing a streamed demo.
I mean, if you think about xCloud, that's a brilliant way to actually evangelize the system there. If you could actually get hands-on time with a game that isn't out yet, that you're genuinely excited about, and the streaming holds up, it's a great way to demo that particular technology.
The extra element about using VR plus streaming is that if you're already in VR, image quality is slightly reduced, right? Because you're up close to a screen, your limited number of pixels. That would essentially hide most of the artifacts that you would encounter with a streaming video. And, it would give you perhaps a better impression, so to speak. And just having if you just had an Xbox pad on your table, you in VR, you just set down the hand controllers and pick up the controller and you're playing the game like that. I think it would actually work really well.
Intriguing. Alex, any thoughts on this?
I'm liking this idea. I've always wanted essentially from E3 where they just show off a vertical slice demo and they say you can play it right now in your browser, immediately after the show. Because, there's been surprise demo drops before after shows, which are always really nice to see. But if they're a little bit worried about getting that content out there in a more controlled form, then streaming is a really easy way to do it, I'd say. So I'd like to see more of that if they could.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next topic. And this one's right down your alley, Alex.
Woo!
Nvidia basically made official DLAA, which is essentially an anti-aliasing form of DLSS. Why don't you take us through it? I think the question is, doesn't DLSS do anti-aliasing already? What's the difference?
Essentially, the difference between DLAA and DLSS is that the resolution of the internal image before any deep learning, anything is being done to it, is the same resolution as the output here. So if you want to play at 4K, the internal resolution is 4K, the output resolution is 4K, and the DL, algorithm, instead of trying to find the pixels from previous frames to reproject at a higher resolution into the current frame, it's using that same idea and technology of using previous frames to anti-alias the current image. Which is essentially what the reconstruction of DLSS is already doing because it's using sub-pixel locations just from previous frames. It's actually already combining reconstruction and anti-aliasing at the exact same time. The idea for this is not new. It was initially put forward as an idea when Turing architecture was announced as DLSS 2X, and that was using the 1.0 version of DLSS, and that would have been doing this exact same thing, native resolution and using the deep learning part of this to do anti-aliasing. That never really came into fruition. It I think it was just a slide, and the reaction of the press and otherwise to DLSS made them go back to their drawing board, and that never really came out. With DLSS 2.0, this technically has always been viable. It's always been a thing you could do. And you could, in some titles using Unreal Engine 4, I've tried it before in the past with Ghost Runner using Unreal Engine Unlocker back in the day with its demo version. So whatever version of Unreal Engine that was at that time and whatever DLSS integration that was at the time, you could force it to actually be native res internally because they had a hidden mode back then. And you could tell very easily it was native res internally because the performance was definitely native res with ray tracing. Back then, it looked really, really good. And DLSS is, or this deep learning anti-aliasing is already a form of temporal anti-aliasing, which all games use nowadays. But since it is having a machine controlling this past history of pixels, instead of humans trying to tune it by scene, and then having that information essentially apply to the whole game, the machine's constantly learning and doing this in real time. So it can do it a lot better. And that means usually in general, this does not apply to all cases, of course, but I've noticed, especially in comparison to something like in Control, there's like less ghosting on just like small wavering objects, less ghosting on transparencies by far. And subpixel information can be done quite a bit better because it's just better at integrating things than a hand-tuned algorithm is. And that's, from what I've seen so far, this was added into the Elder Scrolls Online. From what I've seen so far, the sharpness is actually, in some instances, slightly less than TAA, but it is less, how do you say, less aliased? It is less, so when the picture moves, it has a lot less, fizzle and fuzzle and all these different things. So it is doing essentially the job of anti-aliasing much better in that aspect. But DLSS is a work in progress algorithm. They recently just, I posted about it on Twitter, they kind of opened up their research so that they're going to be posting work in progress versions of DLSS. DLLs you can download and grab for yourself as a gamer or as a developer and try them out. That'll have different image characteristics and properties, which is cool. So right now, DLAA first integration, I've seen only videos and screenshots of this done by other websites and other reviewers. So I haven't touched it myself yet, but based upon what I've seen already in Ghost Runner before, it's great. I hope to see this in the future added to more games as a part of DLSS. It'll be called, I hope it's called something like pristine quality or something like that, because this allows
ultra quality was the term that was being mooted.
That was the proposed name or whatever. But
can I make a different proposition here? I say call it Battaglia quality.
Yeah, whatever.
Then you're getting the best.
You're getting the best. And I would like that because right now in the currently released DLSS games, eventually at some point in time, we're going to be able to run these games at like native, resolutions and things like that. And I still want what DLSS does for edge quality in comparison to normal TAA, actually. So this is a future-proofing thing, and I want that, and I hope those in the audience can push NVIDIA to make it so that all DLSS releases also include DLAA.
Because this is really interesting, right, Alex? Because I'm not sure people are fully aware of the cost of DLSS. And basically, the cost is flat, but the flatness depends on the resolution.
Yeah,
right?
And the GPU, of course, too.
Yeah, and the GPU, of course. So, I think you mentioned the other day that we're reaching the point now where, 4K DLSS on a 3090 doesn't actually have that much cost because it's just got so much tensor power within there. And that's only going to increase over time, right?
There's an interesting case too, where it could technically, DLSS over time could become less expensive than TAAU algorithms at the same resolution. I think this already happens. People have tested it out in Unreal Engine 5 even. I think the Unreal Engine 5 upscaler is technically more expensive on certain GPUs than DLSS.
Okay, well, let's move on to our DF content discussion section. Some interesting topics have emerged. And I think one of the more interesting but also disappointing ones was the ActRaiser Renaissance kind of reimagining that was released recently, where it's kind of weird that a game that runs at 60 frames per second is only updating its camera at 50 frames per second, which is producing entirely how can I say it? It's just shouldn't be there, but judder, it is there. John, you've been looking into this. You've got some interesting findings to share.
Yeah, that's right. So this plagues ActRaiser. It plagues the recent Alex Kidd remake and several other 2D platform-based Unity games that I've played before, and it always drove me nuts. So I actually started talking with a friend of the show, Dean Rands, who has done some Unity work as well, and we kind of think we have what's going on here, essentially. So he put together this little demo thing, which we can show here. And the idea essentially is that, well, by default, the fixed time step value set by Unity is a value of 0.02, which just happens to perfectly align with 50 hertz or 50 frames per second, right? So anything that uses this fixed update call or this value is impacted by this. What we think is happening actually is that for these 2D games especially, they're essentially using a rigid body 2D element, which is one of the options you can do for a 2D game, and then essentially attaching the camera directly to that object. Which, so you'll notice, like with ActRaiser, it's just following the character along, but at the points where the camera breaks free and like zooms to show something else in the 2D mode, it looks perfectly smooth, right? Because it's no longer defined by the motion of that rigid body object. So by default, when the camera is attached to that rigid body, it updates at the same rate as the fixed step there, right? So what seems to be the fix here, at least for this kind of thing, is that if you change that fixed time step value from 0.02 over to, like, say 0.016666667 or something like that, right? Then it updates at 60 frames per second. Now, it's still a fixed update, so I would still argue that attaching your camera in this way isn't necessarily optimal in this era of, multi-refresh rate monitors and such. But either way, the game's clearly targeting 60 FPS. By doing this, it essentially allows the the screen to scroll at a smooth 60 FPS on a 60 hertz display. So by doing the default value looks like this with the judder. Then if you switch it over to this other value here, then it updates at a perfectly smooth 60 frames per second. And I do feel that this behavior of this default value perfectly matches up the exact issue that we're seeing in ActRaiser and Alex Kidd and other similar games. At least the behavior is exactly the same. Now, the caveat, of course, is that by changing the fixed time step, technically, that dictates like the physics calculations, right? So if you're on a lower power platform like the Switch, there is obviously a small performance penalty there by updating the physics at a higher rate. But, in default, ActRaiser, for instance, doesn't even hit 60 FPS anyway on the Switch. And this would be beneficial for every other version, basically. So
Right.
I think that's what's happened. Again, this is just a guess. We can't say for sure. We haven't actually seen these projects, but based on the behavior and the nature of the games that suffer from this, I'm fairly positive that these games are using those rigid body 2D elements with the camera attached to that element, and they're using the default fixed time step, and that's why we're getting the camera judder. And if they just change the default to match for 60 hertz, it wouldn't solve every problem for everybody, but it would make the default game experience dramatically better for most people. So yeah, that's kind of the idea. Now, again, hopefully this is something that can be looked into further. I'd like to, chat with somebody at Unity as well about this. I think, so there is potential here, but I think that's what's happening.
Well, if that is the case, then if I was somebody at Unity, I would be changing that default value.
Fundamentally, that's the thing, right? Just change the default value. And
at least then the chances of this happening again would be minimal. But, if I guess we just need confirmation that this is actually the case on those specific projects. And
that's the caveat that I keep stressing here is like, this is just our guess, basically, right? We haven't seen the projects, but the behavior to me makes me think that might be it. So let's see what happens, and let's hope for a solution. Because if it's really that simple, then it feels like it's something that could absolutely be patched.
thinking about this issue, the Unity issue here, and the ActRaiser issue, we're seeing this more and more in games, actually. Recently, we saw it recently in Deathloop as well, too, with the camera with the mouse, where it still happens at non-60 FPS frame rates, by the way, as of the latest patch, where it like pauses or hyper accelerates the screen because whatever is going on with the mouse calculations and the screen movements, it's not lining up with 60, much like ActRaiser is here, and makes the game look stutterier than it actually is. The frame rate is perfect. And recently, I just talked with Rich about this, but it's also happening in Halo Infinite. I think it's actually happening on all consoles, actually. I think Rich looked through his footage and saw it in his 120 FPS footage as well on Xbox Series X. So there it's slightly different, but it's really important that animation rate lines up with refresh rate for at least things really close to the screen. Further into the distance, it's less important, and games have been doing that for ages, reducing the update rate on things in the distance. But if there's something's right in front of your screen, like the main character, the camera, it needs to be lined up with the refresh rate, always. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to our next topic. And this, we haven't published it yet, but I suspect it's going to prove quite controversial. It's the Medium on PlayStation 5. Now, it launched with no ray tracing support, so we didn't look at it because I guess an issue we have with content is that it sits on the internet forever. And if it just means waiting a week to produce the verdict for a game that is more fully finished, we should probably do that. But fundamentally, the game was patched. Does have ray tracing now on PlayStation 5, but the presentation is very, very different in some respects compared to the existing Series X implementation. And it's kind of curious, to say the least, why the developer made those changes. And it opens up a series of topics for debate. So why don't you clue us in, Alex?
Yeah, so basically, they updated the game to include ray tracing, but and that ray tracing that they included now in Medium and the version that you can play right now is ray traced reflections. But if you compare back to back with the Xbox Series X version or just the PC version using similar settings to the Xbox Series X, you can see really quickly that they've also, for this version of the Medium, which they brought out on PlayStation 5, changed other things around. They've kind of reorganized the rendering load, as I'm going to call it. They took out ray trace ambient occlusion and are using SSAO. That seems like a downgrade, right? They've reduced the resolution of reflections. That seems like a downgrade. And there's a couple of other things, too, that they seem to have stripped out or changed. And the end result is a product on PlayStation 5 where it is actually now, on average, I would say, running better, and has a higher average output resolution. And with the game's usage of temporal anti-aliasing upsampling, it looks a lot more 4K-like and doesn't fizzle as often, like when the camera moves and such, which is great. But this brings up this issue, this kind of question that we could probably bring into the room here, and we could ask the audience as well, too. Would you rather prefer? Because now we have two different versions of the game. One that's lower res with more rendering features and less stable, or one that has less rendering features and has more stable frame rate on average and also higher res. I don't know. How do you guys see this for console games?
I think that's actually a very difficult question, and it's something that's going to vary from game to game and style to style, right? And that's why I do think fundamentally this should be an option, which is something that we see very regularly these days. So it's really nothing new in that regard. But, I think this is simply a question where the developer, if they're not going to offer modes, they need to look at what they're trying to do visually and try to figure out the best solution here. Because, that's what console optimization is really about, right? So you have limited resources. You have to use those resources to produce the best looking image given the circumstances. So it's interesting, though, to see that they essentially kind of seemingly changed their mind, if you will, about this, that's what's unique about this situation, where they simply said, well, you know what, maybe we're going to push for a higher resolution and sacrifice some other things instead.
Yeah, I think, first of all, since this is the content discussion part of the show, it's kind of like a bit of a goldmine in terms of content, because usually there isn't really much in the way of differences between Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. That is kind of like, obviously in terms of the spec differentials, it suggests that one console is more powerful than the other. But in terms of actual real life applications of games, it's been a lot more closer than one might have imagined. But what they're doing here is to essentially change their priorities, right? They've definitely pared back precision of certain effects, but on the flip side, you are getting an increase in resolution. And I agree with you, Alex, when you're using Unreal Engine 4's temporal upscaler, and you reach a certain resolution threshold, you talk about 1620p and 1728p, then you are actually getting something that looks really good on a 4K screen. And that's somewhere where the Series X version didn't quite hit the target. Now, I think the question here, first of all, let us stress that doesn't seem to be about system capabilities as far as we know, right? It seems to be about a genuine refresh of how the game is presented. And as you say in the content, Alex, in a lot of scenarios, it's very difficult to tell the difference. But I think I agree with you that the ambient occlusion on PS5 is not quite as robust as you'd hope. But we come back to what you were talking about, John, which is essentially that this more quality-driven approach that we see on Series X is still there on Series X. I fully believe that they could quite easily roll out the changes that are in the PlayStation 5 version to Series X and offer it as a resolution mode. You could have a resolution mode and a quality mode. And in that case, it kind of, restores parity if both versions have both modes, right? So I think that's probably the way forward. I kind of think that we would probably end up using the resolution mode because it does seem to provide a more consistent overall win, right?
Yeah, I'd say for a game like this, on average, I just felt like the Xbox Series X version, playing it again now, and this version is slightly different than the one John played, by the way. So I felt like it was just switching resolution too often in a way that was a little bit more visible, unlike on PlayStation 5, where it just felt like a much more consistent experience. And the performance difference, even though there's this frame pacing issue there on the PlayStation 5 version, unfortunately, I felt like it still wasn't having those as many issues, like when you load up a new camera angle and it would drop the frame rate really rapidly, which is, obviously that makes sense if you're running two forms of ray tracing on a console and targeting like multiple viewports and all these things like this game does. So I just want another mode added to both versions of the game at this point, actually.
So another piece of content that we put up last week and came out of the blue really, but it really is quite fascinating, is that we do actually have our first example of a native 8K 60 frames per second game on the new wave of consoles. It's the Touryst by Shinen Multimedia, and image quality is just as you'd expect from 8K. Absolutely pristine. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is that for whatever reason, although 8K is written on the box on the PlayStation 5, it doesn't support 8K screens. Not many people have an 8K screen. I think there's two debates to have here, which is basically can and should the consoles be targeting 8K if it is within the bounds of the project? And I guess, what do you think of the Touryst? I guess you did the content, John. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think 8K is the kind of thing that is firmly in the area of, say, 1080p 60 on the PS3, if you will, where it's something that is nice to see. And I think if a developer has a very specific visual target and they have the performance overhead for it, then sure, why not? And they could do this on Xbox, PS5, whatever. And that's completely fine. We've already seen Xbox games doing the 6K, including the Xbox version of the Touryst, but also Ori and the Will of the Wisps. But I really think it's important that 8K should not be something that games are specifically aiming for. I really don't think it's necessary in most cases, where, especially with the image reconstruction techniques we have and already the difficulty at just hitting native 4K and more demanding rendering applications as is. So it's, it's really just a neat to see thing. And it's very, to to me, it almost feels very demo scene, if you will. Like, this feels like the kind of thing that the German demo scene would have been doing back in the day. Is like, yeah, we must push this to the next level, kind of thing. We need more pixels, just because. Like, no shipping game needs to do it, but they've done it here, and that's just cool. So it's neat to see. It's cool that it's actually possible at all, given how demanding 8K is, right? And it just shows that, you know, these guys at Shinen are just technical wizards, I guess you could say. Like, they still roll all their own technology in-house and do all kinds of crazy stuff, and that just makes their games look different. You know what I mean? Like, they have a unique look to them. I mean, especially in this one where they went for the magic of voxel style meshes, and it's neat. But beyond that, of course, you know, as I said in the video, what if you've had a chance to play it, you know, or not, I do recommend giving it a look, because this game is just really, really cool. It's just an absolute joy to play. There's not really much else like it. It's almost hard to explain what it even is. It's just this mysterious exploration platform adventure game with a really cool vibe and a cool visual look. And yeah, if you haven't played it yet and you want to play it and you have a PlayStation console, give it a shot, because beyond the 8K PS5 version, they do, well, that version also has a 4K 120 mode if you want, but then it's also available on PS4 and PS4 Pro.
Not the 4K 120 mode.
No, definitely not. In fact, the PlayStation 4 Professional kind of hangs around the 1440 to 1512p range most of the time. So, yeah, it's at 60, by the way. But the key here, though, is that every single version from the original Switch release up to this, it just runs flawlessly. There's no hiccups. There's no loading, really. It's just everything is instantaneous. As I mentioned in the video, I love the fact that you click on the game on the dashboard, it literally dips to black for like less than a second. And then it just, the first time you play the game, it literally just fires up right on the first island. And you're just playing the game. Like, there's not even like publisher logos. There's not even a main menu. It's just, you click the button and like less than a second later, you're playing the game.
Yeah, I mean, I do have an 8K screen. I've had it for about 9 months, so I do have some insight into what 8K is all about. And first of all, I would prefer to play the Touryst at 4K 120, even if there was a native 8K mode, simply because the win you get from that extra fluidity trumps the extra pixel count. Having played 8K games on PC on this 8K display, you don't seem to get a win in terms of enhanced detail, but you just seem to get really good anti-aliasing, ironically, which is what you get with the Touryst in its 4K mode with anti-aliasing enabled, which kind of makes sense, right? But the other thing which stood out to me is that in a sort of typical living room scenario, you need a big screen. Already, I think that there's a strong case for being at 65 inches for a 4K screen in a living room environment versus 55. It might not sound like much, but the experience is definitely a lot better. And with 8K, I'm at 75 inches, and that's basically kind of like what I think the ground level should be for an 8K display in a living room environment. Obviously, the viewing distances are going to change, but just talking about my experience there.
I got to know, though, what do you think about LG's new 325-inch display that they revealed not too long ago? I think that largest one, it's $1.7 million. So
that's very reasonable.
Yeah, I've got 2 pre-orders in.
I would love to test
it. I would love to see it. I'd love to test it, but it wouldn't fit in my living room.
That's true.
I think fundamentally, unless I moved into sort of this huge environment.
The one that's actually more interesting to me was the ultra wide one. They have a 32:9 one that's also gigantic. So it's basically like having 2 enormous 16:9 screens next to each other.
That's nice, actually.
They call it the ultra stretch.
The ultra stretch. Oh, jeez.
I just think on a general level, people aren't driven towards 8K because there's no content really that sort of that sells it. And traditionally, of course, it's gaming that has driven higher resolution displays, right? You know, Xbox 360, PS3 sort of took us into the 720p era. And, 1080p with PS4, Xbox One, and then with the enhanced consoles, you got more 4K content from your consoles at that point early on than you did in terms of transmissions and Blu-rays and stuff. So the fact that we aren't really seeing gaming taking point for 8K to any meaningful degree kind of speaks for itself. I am going to be curious, though, because obviously when we're talking about the next generation of GPUs, I think even at the moment you can get some quite nice results if you can run DLSS at 4K with performance mode. If you ran that at 8K, upscaling from 4K, I think you'll get some nice results there. The ultra performance mode, which tries for 8K from 1440p, it's kind of content dependent. It's not a definite win there. But I'm kind of curious if we will just reach the horsepower threshold required in a generation or two to actually make 8K fully viable on new games. But I just don't see it taking off at the moment for the reasons stated. 4K still kind of seems overkill. But that's just what I think. Okay, so let's move on. It's time for one of our favorite parts of the show, which is where we field questions from our supporters on the Digital Foundry Supporter Program. And yes, of course, if you want to pose your own questions, get involved. Join the supporter program. Join our Discord, where we're regularly talking with our supporters. It's an awesome environment. But officially, Q&A is here. And we're going to start off with a question from, actually two questions, from Lee Ashton. Let's tackle the first one first. And here we go with this one. Considering some people prefer physical media, eyes on John, why not release games on USB sticks? They can be packaged in boxes. All consoles have USB, and I'm sure they could add some DRM to prevent duplication. John.
I mean, isn't that kind of what Nintendo's done with their cartridge solution? I mean, it's effectively the same kind of idea as a USB stick, just in a proprietary form. It's not a terrible idea, but I think anything like that would also take on a proprietary form. And I'd actually be on board with that. But I think the problem now is just component cost when you're manufacturing. Like, it's very cheap to make optical discs. And currently you have to install it to a drive anyway. So the speed of that and everything, not a big deal. I think it's not something they're really looking at as much. Now, what I would like to see, but we won't see because of cost, is say...
I know what John's going to say.
That, the Xbox Series X/S, that SSD, the add-on SSD, that thing would be the best physical media card I could imagine. Just like, my goodness. How cool would that be? That would be so satisfying to have games ship on something like that. But, obviously it would be much, much smaller than the one you buy because it would only need to hold the game. And theoretically, I've always wanted a system where you could, like, say, install patches directly onto the media, like patch the card directly, though I'm sure there's security concerns there. But that's what I would like to see. But again, the cost of manufacturing is really high for that, so I don't think we ever would. But so USBs kind of occupy that same space as an optical disc, where it's not fast enough to play the games now, but it's still more expensive than doing a disc, and I think that's probably why we're not going to see it.
I mean, my question is, what's the point? Do we want more expensive games? Because the basic cost of pressing a Blu-ray at this point is quite cheap. This sounds like a nightmare in terms of costs. And if we actually think back to the cartridge era, I remember actually thinking about it. There was, when I was on the official Sega magazine, there was a point where Sega were going to put out Virtua Racing, which had that embedded 3D processing chip. And the game was going to cost £100. £100 in like 95, 94? £100 for a game. And that was specifically tied to their kind of currency conversion rates, but fundamentally the cost of making that cartridge. And we were already reeling from higher prices on today's games, which, we're being told is because of the additional development effort.
Also, Rich, I want to interject and say we've already seen a negative effect of this on the Switch, where developers often opt for the absolute smallest cart size in order to save on manufacturing costs, and that has a detrimental effect. Sometimes it causes them to compress assets to an uncomfortably small size in order to fit it on there, which has an impact on the quality there. Sometimes it becomes the game itself is over compressed to the point where it actually impacts performance because you have to decompress everything to actually use it. I think Rayman was like that back in the day, where it loaded slowly from the cart. And you also have this like mandate from on high where, you know, the executives are like, well, you gotta fit your game in this 4 gigabyte card. Sorry. And it's just, sometimes that's difficult to do. And the end result of that then is not, if you don't end up compressing it, then what we've seen instead is, oh, well, now you have to download something. If a big banner says the game is not completely on the card, you actually have to download stuff from the internet. So what's the point?
There is a problem with physical media, especially when you open it up and there's a download code in there. Alex, can you foresee an occasion where you would like to buy a game on a USB stick for your PC?
No, never. I lose USB sticks all the time, honestly.
That's another good point.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on to Lee's second question, which again seems to be focused on throwback technology. And it's addressed specifically to you, John. Why do you think there is no resurgence of boutique CRT manufacturers? You can buy vinyl turntables, cassette players, and CD players. I would imagine there would be a niche, but strong market, I don't think I disagree with that, for high-quality modern CRTs. The tech would surely be better nowadays.
I think fundamentally this doesn't work for 2 reasons. First of all, the manufacturing process, it's very, very difficult in terms of, one, you need a special line constructed to support this. That's big money, right? You can't just do this small time as far as I can see. The actual knowledge for building a cathode ray tube is also kind of gone by the wayside. And I just don't think that there's interest from anyone to invest money in building a factory, training people, getting all those very specific processes in place again to make it. And there might still be someone in China, I think, that makes them. I'm not 100% sure, but it's very rare now. Those factories basically do not exist anymore. And that's much, much more expensive to do than like a vinyl turntable, right? It's a completely different world. But beyond that, there's also the environmental concerns. I mean, I love CRTs, but the nature of building CRTs and what they represent, it's not exactly good for the planet. It's not green enough to actually work in today's climate. So I don't think that's a viable solution on that front either. Where I would like to see things change, though, is I want to see more research in being poured into understanding and duplicating what it is that CRTs do well, right? We've already seen the motion side. It's being addressed and its progress is being made with things like black frame insertion and ultra low motion blur and those technologies. It's not 100% there, but it's getting there. It's pretty good. But then there's things like you could say variable resolution support. I mean, technically a CRT has sort of either a shadow mask or a slot mask or something that sort of defines the maximum res, but due to the electron beam scanning a phosphor screen nature of a CRT, you can display lower resolutions without really degrading the quality. It eliminates that need for scaling, which means, you know, this is something I've wanted for a long time. There's all this effort being poured into like DLSS and all these other techniques and machine learning. And fundamentally, why are they doing it? It's to make up for a limitation of fixed pixel displays, in my opinion. It's because of that. It's because when you're not at the same resolution as a fixed pixel display, you have to scale it up, and scale introduces blur. So they're finding ways to try to get it up there to match the pixel grid as best as they can, using all these techniques to make it look good. And all this effort's being poured there, but what about the display itself? That's just, I don't know, that's been a pet peeve of mine for a long time. Everything seems to be focused 100% on this fixed pixel matrix for screens. And I guess now that we're getting to these really high pixel counts, especially when you look at like 8K, it starts to matter less. But I don't know. I'm just curious to know what else is possible from that front. You know what I mean?
Okay, well, let's move on to the next question. Neon 5, Neon V, apologies if I have mispronounced your hacker alias. It seems like the modern... Sorry, let me start again. It seems like the random read I/O requirements for current games like Ratchet & Clank is not that big, under 190,000 for the Western Digital SN750 SE, whereas the internal SSD in PS5 in theory should be able to do over 1 million 4K IOPS. So my question is, what do you see as potential use cases for future games to utilize that many random read IOPS? Considering real-time fast traversal, e.g. portals in Ratchet & Clank, is already possible using alternative techniques using much slower hardware. So I guess this kind of stems from all of the research that's been done with very slow SSDs, or relatively slow SSDs, I should say, on the PlayStation 5, where Ratchet & Clank, which is considered to be one of the most storage-heavy games, is still running just fine. There are ways and means which our supporters have been looking at to actually reduce SSD bandwidth still further, and the game still seems playable. But I guess the fundamental thing, Alex, is that we've been talking about bandwidth on these SSDs as kind of like the defining metric of performance, when there's a lot more to an SSD than its sequential read alone.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's something we learned really quickly back in the day when SSDs came first out, and you could just see the Windows experience was very dramatically different, because you would click on the start menu and there would be no loading time. That would be something that would happen when you'd have an SSD, because of this random read-write 4K being a lot higher on SSDs, and a reasonable amount higher on NVMEs as well. Here, I think when we start talking about the use case for this, there actually hasn't been that much in games so far. There was good testing back in the day by Gamers Nexus regarding this, examining, you can profile an SSD pretty easily to see the size of the reads that are going on during a game, and the random small 4K ones were happening mainly during level load, actually. So that's when they would come up, but not during the gameplay. And I think one of the reasons for this is because that is not latency sensitive when you're loading a level up. Exactly. And so you have to still be worried about this, because even the really nice fast SSD on the PS5 is still a good deal of milliseconds away from a real-time frame rate. So they can only utilize that to a certain degree. That's why they stream over these larger files over a larger period of time. And that's good. It's used really well in Ratchet and Clank. But I think when we start talking about utilizing this 1 million 4K IOPS, I think it's less practical for the current way games are designed. And I honestly can't think of a use case at the top of my head, just theoretically. And we start going to the realm of, why not invest at that point in technologies that are closer to main virtual video memory or main memory. So we have like Intel Optane. There's also Sony had something I think they made in this direction. It was called like ReRAM or something like that. Maybe that's Toshiba, I forget. But there's other technologies that are basically smaller containers, like 32 or 64 gigabytes, but they're closer to main memory. And so you're not wasting cycles, and they're latency efficient in a way that is more usable than maybe these 1 million 4K IOPS. But that's my answer to this. I don't know. Do you guys have anything?
Well, when I was speaking to Mark Cerny about this, he was describing scenarios where, let's say you've got, 16 milliseconds or 33 milliseconds per frame. He was talking about requesting information at the beginning of the frame generation process, and you would have that by the next frame that's going to be generated. So, this is kind of like, I think, an example of how these SSDs are being engineered, not for the games of the here and now, but to give developers legroom for the games to come. Right? I think the bottom line is that despite the various videos that have come out, it's highly unlikely that Ratchet and Clank, in the state that it is, in the way it was developed at this point, I don't think it would run on a hard drive you'd have to specifically engineer for the hard drive rather than just taking advantage of the inherent advantages of the SSDs. But it's early days for accessing those SSDs and getting the most out of them.
I think there's actually some of the confusion because there was that video out recently about debunking the SSD requirement, right? And I don't think he's saying that Ratchet and Clank itself would run on as it is on a hard drive. It's more that the techniques they employ there can be employed in other ways and still function on that kind of hardware. It's more about scaling the assets up, right? It's like you have to work with what you have in terms of overall bandwidth. It's like, okay, PS2 era game, they were able to do stuff like that in real time, and they instantly switch between areas, but the size of the assets and how much memory you were filling was so much smaller. It's a completely different thing, right?
Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one's for you, Alex, I reckon. From Lee Yarker. He talks a lot about DLSS in his questions.
Thanks, Lee.
He's got another DLSS question.
He loves it.
I love it too.
Don't we all? Can the AI tech used in DLSS and DLAA be transferred to other graphical improvements, say textures, global illuminations, or particle effects, etc.?
Yes. So as an example of that, you can just think of anything that has a really complex texture surface where storing that surface, that representation of the surface, becomes stupid. Just like there's no really good way to store that. For example, like a fuzzy ball, and it's actually like real 3D fuzz, not just like like 2D textures aligned to a plane all over the thing. Like actually like the real 3D-ness of that fuzz. There's really no good way to store that in a way that can move around a game world very easily. Okay, that's what machine learning can do. It can say, like, I can approximate the look of that in real time for you. And, NVIDIA has shown this in research already for things like this. Global illumination, there's probably a lot of ways that it could be used for that. But the most recent one that NVIDIA also showed off was essentially, instead of having real rays shot around the environment, it would use previous rays from previous frames, or even some rays generated in the new frame, to estimate essentially the other paths that ray would have taken in that frame if it kept on going. And it does a really, really good job of it. It starts approximating like higher rays per pixels, like orders of magnitude in terms of quality. That's really good. And for textures, in real time, this one's a hard one. I'm not sure about textures, but offline, it's been done in the past where, games have used, I think John even saw it in recently, or at least presumed it was that way in Skyward Sword, right? You presumed that they might have used it for a couple of the environmental textures there.
That was kind of the assumption because the art lined up so perfectly, but the actual texel size was different between them in a way that made it had that characteristic look of AI upscaled imagery. But it did work really well in that case.
But that was offline. So in terms of real time, it's hard. I can't say for textures in real time. Maybe it's something like paint flecks in a texture could be done with machine learning.
I'm not sure it's necessary to apply machine learning to that in real time when there's so many other applications where it is useful.
I think that's about all I can say about that. There's just so much more research coming out about this all the time now. I think it's just going to keep accelerating, and we're going to see more novel things over the next 2 years, probably.
Well, let's move on to a new question by Demstill, and it's kind of workflow related, really. Hey, DFT, he says, did you consider moving the filming of the DF Direct to Friday and adjusting dates accordingly? We typically film on Thursday morning. Filming on Thursday means missing a lot of important weekly news that had to be covered on next week's Direct, while filming on Friday, from what I noticed on recent months, would not miss anything major. Thursday had a lot of news and even showcases that you missed for the week, so wondering if you considered the move. Well, we've certainly considered it, and we've actually done it in one or two scenarios, but John?
I mean, fundamentally, it's just somebody has to edit the show, right? And that's somebody's Audi. So this is essentially so that, we don't want to have to make him work every weekend or something on editing the show, right? Like realistically, it's not a fair thing to do to somebody, I feel. And it's not exactly easy to get this done just on like the afternoon, because by the time we're finished, it's like after lunch, and then, it's not great. And beyond that, it's not just filming it. We also have to each encode our final videos into a smaller format. Then we have to upload it, send him the link. Then he has to download everything and then find all the assets to go with it. Sometimes we have to send those assets. I mean, it wouldn't really start full edit necessarily until like Saturday morning. So
that's not good.
That's kind of the thing. So I guess what we've done in the past is sometimes is essentially patch in extra news bits when appropriate. If something big happens, we just gather again and film another segment and try to, through the magic of editing, kind of slam it in there.
I mean, that's something that we have done, which is, I think last week, due to scheduling issues and availability, you actually did film on Friday. Other times we have basically shot the bulk of it on Thursday and then carefully rearranged our desks on Friday to make it look as though we're filming on Thursday, but we're actually doing a pickup section that could be more easily slotted in. But yeah, fundamentally, the reason why we film on Thursday is to do the best that we can to guarantee that Patreon supporters get early access to the Direct on Saturday. And that wouldn't really be possible otherwise. That's kind of about it. And let's move on to the next question. It's from somebody who's got possibly the best username, Mr. Bespoke. I like this guy. I like him already. What's the biggest technical issue or issues you have ever faced when trying to create content for Digital Foundry or DF Retro? Alex, this might be an interesting one for you.
Back in the day, it definitely has to be unexplainable tearing on consoles, PlayStation consoles, and being unable to capture it well in your recording. So you do your recording. Back in the day, this is before we had the new tool necessarily, and you'd look at it and it'd be like 60 FPS with tearing or something like that, and it's maybe not catching it all, and you're like, oh no, like this kind of thing. That means for that, this is a technical hurdle where you have to look at talking back and forth with the team, examine the footage itself to see if grain's coming in some way on like a really fine level, and then you have to keep constantly testing the game in an area where it will be tearing, and then you have to make sure it's getting caught. This is really just like really annoying work. There's no joy to be had in any of this. And
no joy.
It is like, we don't have this issue as often anymore, thankfully. And for a while now, also thankfully, Xbox games for some reason preferred to have 60 FPS tearing and PlayStation ones didn't. I think it just recently happened in Call of Duty Vanguard, actually. This is another thing where I don't know what it is, but when just the basic thing you want to do for your game, the recording is not working well, it throws the entire project off. And I've usually had it with the 60 FPS tearing issue.
I mean, I don't know where to begin with this one. I guess, first of all, if we go all the way back to, 2007, 2008, just the whole concept of visualizing frame rate in a video was a challenge. And it's a challenge that we kind of rose to and gradually started to understand how frame rate analysis, basically how frames are presented. That was basically the foundation work. Now, in theory, it's all really straightforward because, assuming there's a game running with VSync, it is literally a case of seeing how many times the same frame is duplicated and then averaging it out over 60 frames. That's it. That's on the face of it. That is incredibly simple, right? But then we have stuff like adaptive sync, screen tearing as it manifests on screen, which causes a lot of issues. And Alex is right. When you're seeing screen tearing at 60 frames per second, at the very basic level, if the tear is moving down, the game is running slower than 16.7 milliseconds, or rather higher than 16.7, so the frame rate is lower. But if the tear is going up, it's actually really difficult to see to track that tear, because the game is actually running faster than 60 frames per second. The frame times are lower than 16.7. So yes, that does present problems. But I do potentially have a solution to that, which I might talk to you about later. Unfortunately, it's not something we can do on ourselves. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big technological issue. The whole concept of actually visualizing performance, which is a foundation of what we do. I guess the latest issue would be the whole move to 4K, right? Because typically the workflow was to basically bring in the output of the HDMI port onto your PC in a mathematically lossless format. It's not really too much of an issue at 720p, but there is an issue when you move to 1080p. It was just about containable at that point. However, when you get to 4K and you're still using mathematically lossless codecs, you're looking at like at the minimum between 100 to about 200. Actually, I've seen it about 300. So 100 to 300 megabytes of data per second. And it's just not viable. It's just totally nuts. So you've got two options there. You basically downscale to 1080p and carry on as normal, or you want to retain 4K and you use lossy compression. And, what we did was to basically relocate the frame rate detection process from after recording video to before compressing it. And that was how we overcame that issue. There are so many other sort of technological issues we've had to overcome. This question's kind of taken me a bit by surprise, but those are the ones that spring to mind. The DF Retro side of things, though, John, that's an interesting one, right? From Mr. Bespoke.
I mean, you covered kind of the main issues that we've covered, of course. I still have nightmares of that Shadow Warrior video on PS4 back in the day, where it was like going through every single frame and manually inserting torn frames due to the way they did VSync. It took me like an entire day. It was not fun. But on the retro side, usually almost everything that it's not too bad on the retro side now. Like for a while, it was issues with getting the scalers to interface correctly with the capture cards in a way that was actually convenient and easy. I like to use the Atomus products, for instance, and until like say the RetroTink 5X Pro, nothing worked with it. So because they sent out non-standard video signals, so that was a little bit of a pain. And then it's just, I find that anything capture related, like when it just doesn't work for some reason, even though it always does normally work, and you just fire something up, you're not getting a signal. It's always somewhere in the chain, something is off. You don't know why. And it's just troubleshooting the entire chain of video along the way to figure out like why something stopped working and why are you getting noise or an issue along the way. That's frustrating. But beyond that, I think, this another thing that you guys didn't mention is just when you have PC issues, specifically like with like Premiere, for instance. Like sometimes certain projects just act up. They just crash like crazy, or you're getting issues with exporting and or something's just not importing correctly. And there's all those types of things that can pop up from time to time. And nothing makes you want to bang your head on the desk more than that kind of thing, especially when you lose progress. It's like usually the autosave works. Sometimes it doesn't work. And so I'm always trying to remember to hit Control S.
Yeah, I'm doing it constantly.
And so
yeah, I think the other thing is basically just the move to 4K in general has in the editing and production side, it slows things down dramatically, far more than the 4x increase in pixels versus 1080p. So, just the process of editing 4K is slower, much slower. Exporting your video, encoding your video, it's much, much slower than 1080p.
Everything takes so much time with 4K comparatively.
Absolutely. I think that pretty much comprehensively addresses that one from Mr. Bespoke.
It was bespoke.
Now, I hope you enjoyed the bespoke answer. Okay, so let's move on to the final question. Now, I have been accused in the past of carefully curating questions to bait my fellow panel members. And yes, I've done it again. This one is from Somatic.
Mm-hmm.
Afternoon, gentlemen, he says. It's afternoon. Are we as gamers currently placing too much to the altar of ray tracing? I sometimes struggle to tell the difference between it and other less expensive methods in quite a few games. And when do you think the tipping point will be breached to be able to fully utilize RT with current console hardware? So, I did float this question earlier and I could see the fury rising within Alex Battaglia. So, Alex, why don't you tackle this one?
I would say, no, we aren't. Yes, it always requires context as to what's being done. You don't just want to say the word ray tracing for the purpose of it and then look at the game like Godfall and have an absolutely useless ray tracing implementation. You actually want it to be affecting the main core visuals of the game in some way or improving the experience in some way as an option, not necessarily always forced. That's where I think the difference lies in a game being designed around this in the first place. And, we saw it with Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. I think we recently also saw it with Deathloop, but it's just less obvious there, where the first level of the game was quite obviously designed with ray trace shadows in mind, which is very interesting. And, there it has a really meaningful effect. And we're in this transition period when games will be using it in a way that's a little bit more of an afterthought. And there, I'll agree with you, you'll have sometimes trouble seeing it in certain scenes because, not every scene is going to benefit in the exact same way as others. Different views look different for reasons. But when we reach that point where games are starting to do it as the base default way they do things, and it's already starting to happen, it's going to be happening more and more, then you'll be noticing bigger returns, and it'll also cost less because they'll be taking it into account in the initial planning areas of the game. So I will say, no, we aren't. We should keep praying on this altar, offering up as much as we can until it is standardized to the point where it's in every game out there always. And I think it's something great to demand of games that are coming out that are, saying they're going to have high-end visuals to a certain degree. It's like, actually, there's limits to rasterization. There's probably ways to do it with ray tracing that are better looking. And last part of this question, when do we think we'll reach this ability to fully utilize current console hardware? Well, we're not going to be seeing a lot of path trace stuff on current console hardware, unfortunately, yet. Maybe at the end of the generation we'll be surprised, but I think we're going to see it in super meaningful way in about 2 to 3 years, where every AAA game that comes out will essentially have it no matter what. That's kind of where we're going. Yeah.
Isn't Minecraft RTX or the Minecraft thing, that's path traced, isn't it?
For sure.
It is,
yeah.
but we haven't seen it beyond the demo.
That's what I'm saying. The very first thing we ever saw running on a Series X was actually a path trace demo.
And we still haven't seen it for no reason.
And now it's not here. But Alex, I wanted to add one more thing for this gentleman and why the altar of ray tracing is so important to be worshiping at. It's not just about us. It's also about the people making the games, because doing all those rasterization tricks takes a lot of extra time and effort to essentially fake the viewer, and just moving the workflow to a fully ray traced solution, I also think makes life easier for artists and people actually working on the game. And I think that is another very important reason why we need to be moving in that direction. Yeah,
I'm just thinking of Ratchet and Clank, actually, where I don't think the game looks as good without ray tracing, but the option is there. But, if you think about it, you've got a 60 FPS performance mode with a higher resolution than the performance RT mode. But I'm just not interested in the performance mode anymore. I am interested in performance RT. I am interested in the 40 FPS lock fidelity mode on 120 hertz screens. It seems to me that developers are doing a really good job, first of all, of integrating ray tracing when they're specifically addressing it as a serious design target. And secondly, you're getting a really good experience from it, and you're getting something that you aren't getting with pure rasterization. So, yeah, I mean, to go back to the question, are just loving this imagery of placing too much at the altar of ray tracing. It's kind of like, some kind of demonic ritual we're sort of instigating here. I'm sort of getting vibes of Monoran from Indiana Jones. And,
hearts.
But fundamentally it's about balance, right? And also about what the developers want to get out of the new generation of games. We've already seen it with 4A games where they're saying, right, okay, ray tracing works for us. We think it works for users. We can do it at 60 frames per second. Let's do it. So, ultimately it's going to be the developers that make the choices here. And let's just see how ray tracing develops across the generation. I do think one thing that is slightly problematic is Series S. Because for whatever reason, whether it's memory, whether it's GPU horsepower, we're seeing titles that don't have ray tracing modes that are available elsewhere. And we saw with Metro Exodus that they did get ray tracing running on it, but it came at the expense of, at its worst, a really big drop to resolution. So, and also that there's also similar things with 120 hertz there, where the Series S is capable of doing it, but is doing it at a much lower resolution than you'd kind of like. But, ultimately, it's watch this space, really. There's already been some amazing stuff. So I can't wait to see more.
I also worshipped the altar of ray tracing. It makes colors look much better than in GT7.
Well, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm convinced.
I'm also convinced.
Okay, well, look, let's wrap this up. Really good show. Thanks for joining me on this one. And if you enjoyed the show and you'd like to see it early, join the DF supporter program. And just generally, like, subscribe, share. If you enjoyed the content, ring the bell for instant notifications, notionally instant notifications, of course.
Said instant.
And I did, yeah. What can I say? But yes, beyond that, just thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.